When Marcus told me women couldn't lead during that board meeting, I smiled politely and took notes like the good little marketing coordinator I was supposed to be. What he didn't know was that I'd been quietly documenting every strategic failure, every missed opportunity, and every client we'd lost under his leadership for the past 2 years. By the time I walked out of that conference room, I wasn't just planning my next campaign. I was planning his downfall and my rise to the CEO position he thought belonged to him forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The fluorescent lights in the Pinnacle Dynamics conference room cast that particular shade of corporate beige that made everyone look slightly ill, which seemed fitting given what I was about to witness. I sat in my usual spot at the far end of the mahogany table, laptop open, fingers poised over the keys, ready to capture every brilliant insight from our quarterly strategy meeting. 26 years old, 3 years out of business school, and still treated like the office secretary, despite my MBA and the fact that my marketing campaigns had single-handedly saved 2 major client relationships in the past year. Marcus Blackwood commanded the head of the table like he owned it, which technically he did, being the CEO and founder's son who'd inherited his position through bloodline rather than competence. 42 years old, silver threading through, his perfectly styled hair, wearing a suit that cost more than my monthly rent, and possessing the kind of confidence that comes from never having to prove yourself to anyone. He had that particular brand of arrogance that wealthy men wear like cologne, subtle but unmistakable to anyone who's learned to recognize the scent. The quarterly numbers spread across the table told a story that Marcus seemed determined to ignore. Revenue down 18% from the previous year, 3 major clients had terminated their contracts, and our biggest competitor had just launched a campaign that was embarrassingly similar to the proposal I'd submitted 6 months ago that Marcus had rejected as too aggressive. But instead of addressing these mounting problems, Marcus was explaining to the 12-person leadership team why our struggles were inevitable market forces beyond anyone's control. Jennifer Walsh, our chief financial officer, and one of only 2 other women in senior leadership, was methodically working through the financial breakdown with the patience of someone who'd learned that challenging Marcus directly led to being labeled as difficult or emotional. Jennifer had 20 years of experience turning around struggling companies, but in every meeting I'd attended, her expertise was consistently overshadowed by Marcus's need to be the smartest person in the room. She'd present data, offer solutions, and watch Marcus nod thoughtfully before explaining why her approach wouldn't work, usually followed by him proposing a watered-down version of her idea as if it were his own innovation. The other woman in leadership, Patricia Reeves, had been with Pinnacle Dynamics since before Marcus took over, back when his father Robert still ran the company with the kind of strategic vision that had built their reputation in the first place. Patricia oversaw operations with military precision, keeping the trains running on time while everyone else focused on the big-picture strategy that seemed to change direction every quarter. She rarely spoke in these meetings anymore, having learned that her decades of institutional knowledge were viewed as resistance to change rather than wisdom worth consulting. David Chen from Business Development sat to Marcus's right, nodding along with whatever direction the conversation took. David was brilliant at what he did, had connections throughout the industry that any company would envy, but had perfected the art of agreeable silence that kept him employed while more vocal colleagues found themselves suddenly redundant. Michael Torres from Human Resources occupied a similar position on Marcus's left, taking notes about personnel adjustments that would inevitably follow any strategic pivots Marcus decided to implement. I watched this dance of corporate hierarchy with the anthropological fascination of someone studying a foreign culture. Every gesture, every carefully modulated tone, every strategic pause designed to navigate the complex power dynamics that Marcus had established since taking control 3 years ago. The unspoken rules were clear. Agree enthusiastically, offer minor modifications that don't challenge core assumptions, and never, ever suggest that the fundamental problem might be leadership itself. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was the only person in that room who'd actually read the competitor analysis reports, studied the market research data, and spent sleepless nights developing strategies that could address our actual problems, rather than the symptoms Marcus preferred to focus on. My marketing background meant I understood customer psychology, brand positioning, and market dynamics in ways that complemented but didn't threaten the established expertise around the table. Or so I'd thought until that morning's revelation changed everything. 6 months earlier, I'd submitted a comprehensive rebranding proposal that addressed our declining market share through targeted demographic expansion, strategic partnership, development, and a digital transformation initiative that would modernize our client engagement systems. The proposal had taken me 3 months to develop, researching industry trends, analyzing competitor strategies, and creating detailed implementation timelines with projected ROI calculations for every major component. It was the kind of thorough, innovative thinking that business schools train you to produce, but corporate hierarchies rarely allow junior employees to implement. Marcus had dismissed the proposal during a brief meeting in his office, barely glancing at the presentation materials before explaining that the company needed to focus on core competencies rather than experimental ventures. The rejection stung, but I'd accepted it as part of the learning process, another step in paying my dues while building the experience necessary to eventually contribute at a higher level. Young professionals were supposed to absorb these setbacks, use them as motivation to improve, and wait patiently for opportunities to prove themselves through smaller, safer initiatives. What I hadn't expected was to see my exact strategy implemented by Richardson & Associates, our primary competitor, 3 months later. Not similar ideas or parallel thinking, but precise details that could only have come from someone with access to my original proposal. The demographic targeting, the partnership structures, even the specific digital platforms I'd recommended for customer engagement, all executed with the kind of resources and market positioning that Pinnacle Dynamics could have leveraged if Marcus had been capable of recognizing good ideas regardless of their source. The success of Richardson's campaign was impossible to ignore. They'd gained market share in segments we'd been losing for 2 years, signed partnership deals with companies I'd specifically identified as strategic opportunities, and launched a digital presence that made our corporate website look like it belonged in 2010. Industry publications were calling it the marketing breakthrough of the year, praising Richardson's innovative approach to customer acquisition and retention strategies that perfectly matched current market demands. That morning, 20 minutes before our quarterly strategy meeting, Jennifer Walsh had stopped by my desk with an expression that suggested she'd discovered something troubling. She'd been researching Richardson's recent success for competitive intelligence purposes when she'd noticed similarities between their campaign and materials I'd shared during internal presentations. The conversation that followed confirmed what I'd already suspected but hadn't wanted to acknowledge. Someone had leaked my proposal, allowing our competitor to implement my strategy, while Marcus continued to insist that Pinnacle Dynamics needed to stay the course with traditional approaches. The betrayal cut deeper than professional disappointment. Someone in our leadership team had access to confidential strategic documents and had chosen to share them with external parties rather than advocate for implementing them internally. The leak wasn't just about stealing ideas, it was about actively undermining the company's competitive position while maintaining the appearance of collaborative teamwork. Whoever had done this had decided that Marcus's ego was more important than Pinnacle Dynamics' success, and they were willing to sabotage our market position to maintain their own comfortable relationship with ineffective leadership. As Marcus continued his quarterly presentation, explaining why external market forces were responsible for our declining performance, I found myself studying the faces around the table with new understanding. One of these people had sold out their own company to protect a CEO whose strategic vision was systematically destroying the business his father had built. The leak represented everything wrong with corporate culture that prioritized maintaining hierarchy over achieving results, protecting incompetent leaders over advancing innovative solutions. The numbers Marcus was presenting painted a clear picture that he seemed determined to misinterpret. Customer satisfaction scores had dropped to their lowest levels in company history. Client retention rates were falling quarter over quarter, and our market share in key demographics was evaporating as competitors implemented exactly the kind of strategies I'd proposed 6 months ago. But instead of acknowledging these failures as leadership problems requiring strategic changes, Marcus was attributing everything to market volatility and temporary industry adjustments that would naturally correct themselves with patience and persistence. Jennifer Walsh's financial analysis told a different story. The company was burning through cash reserves at an unsustainable rate. Operating expenses were increasing while revenue declined, and the cost of acquiring new clients had tripled as our brand reputation deteriorated in key markets. Patricia Reeves's operational reports showed declining employee morale, increasing turnover in critical departments, and systemic inefficiencies that compounded every quarter as Marcus ignored recommendations from department heads who understood the day-to-day realities of running the business. David Chen's business development updates revealed the most damaging trends. Potential partnership opportunities were being lost to competitors who offered more innovative collaboration structures. Major clients were expressing concerns about Pinnacle Dynamics' strategic direction and industry relationships that had taken decades to build were eroding as key contacts began viewing the company as outdated and inflexible. The strategic partnerships I'd identified in my original proposal were being signed by Richardson and Associates, who somehow knew exactly which companies represented the highest value opportunities. Michael Torres's human resources metrics showed the internal cost of Marcus's leadership approach. Exit interviews consistently mentioned lack of strategic vision, limited advancement opportunities for innovative thinking, and frustration with decision-making processes that prioritized maintaining control over achieving results. The company was losing talented employees who were finding better opportunities with competitors who valued their contributions and implemented their suggestions rather than dismissing them based on hierarchical considerations. But the most revealing aspect of that morning's meeting was watching how information flowed through the room. When Jennifer presented concerning financial trends, Marcus immediately redirected attention to external factors beyond the company's control. When Patricia mentioned operational inefficiencies, he acknowledged the problems while explaining why implementing her recommended solutions would be premature, given current market conditions. When David raised concerns about competitive disadvantages, Marcus assured him that Pinnacle Dynamics' established reputation would ultimately prevail over short-term tactical advantages gained by rivals. The pattern was unmistakable. Every problem identified by experienced professionals was acknowledged but not addressed. Every solution proposed was considered but not implemented, and every strategic opportunity was recognized but not pursued. Marcus had created a leadership structure that generated the appearance of collaborative decision-making while ensuring that no significant changes could occur without his personal approval that never seemed to materialize for initiatives that might challenge his fundamental assumptions about business strategy. I sat at the far end of that conference table, fingers moving steadily across my laptop keyboard, documenting every exchange with the methodical precision that had become my signature approach to corporate survival. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. 26 years old in a room full of executives with decades more experience, but increasingly convinced that experience without wisdom was more dangerous than youth without opportunity. The marketing coordinator who was supposed to take notes and implement decisions made by people who understood business better than she did, except that those people were systematically destroying the company through incompetence disguised as conservative leadership. The moment that changed everything came during Marcus's explanation of why Pinnacle Dynamics couldn't compete with Richardson and Associates' recent market expansion. He was standing at the whiteboard, gesturing toward charts that showed declining market share, explaining how their success represented unfair competitive advantages rather than superior strategy implementation. The condescension in his voice was unmistakable as he detailed why Richardson's approach wouldn't work long-term, why their rapid growth was unsustainable, and why Pinnacle Dynamics' measured response demonstrated superior business judgment. Then Jennifer Walsh made the mistake of suggesting that perhaps the company should consider similar strategies, maybe explore some of the innovative approaches that seem to be working so well for competitors. Her tone was diplomatic, her language carefully chosen to avoid challenging Marcus directly, but her suggestion carried the implicit criticism that Pinnacle Dynamics might need to change its fundamental approach to remain competitive in evolving markets. Marcus's response revealed everything about his character and leadership philosophy. He turned from the whiteboard with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, the kind of expression that powerful men use when they need to correct someone without appearing openly hostile. The pause that followed stretched just long enough to make everyone in the room uncomfortable, long enough for Jennifer to realize she'd crossed some invisible line that would require careful navigation to avoid professional consequences. When Marcus finally spoke, his voice carried the patient tone of someone explaining obvious truths to people who should know better. He acknowledged Jennifer's concerns, praised her dedication to the company's success, and then explained why. Her suggestion demonstrated a fundamental misunderstanding of business leadership. Women, he said with the authority of someone stating scientific fact, tend to focus on short-term tactical adjustments rather than long-term strategic vision. They excel at implementing decisions made by others but struggle with the complex thinking required for executive-level leadership that considers multiple variables across extended timeframes. The silence that followed was deafening. 12 people sitting around a conference table, processing the reality that their CEO had just explained why women couldn't handle real leadership responsibilities during a meeting where the company's only female executives had provided the most accurate analysis of problems and the most practical solutions for addressing them. Jennifer Walsh, whose financial expertise had prevented the company from making several catastrophic investment decisions over the past 2 years, sat motionless as Marcus continued his explanation of why emotional decision-making created by biological differences made women unsuitable for roles requiring objective strategic analysis. Patricia Reeves, who had been managing complex operational systems longer than Marcus had been alive, maintained her professional composure while he detailed how women's natural inclination toward collaboration and consensus building undermined the decisive leadership necessary for competitive business environments. The irony was staggering. Marcus was explaining why women couldn't lead while simultaneously demonstrating leadership failures that were destroying the company his father had spent 40 years building. But the most revealing aspect of Marcus's commentary was how comfortable he seemed making these statements in front of people whose professional success directly contradicted his theories. This wasn't an off-the-cuff remark or momentary lapse in judgment. This was a carefully considered explanation of his worldview, delivered with the confidence of someone who'd never questioned these assumptions because his position protected him from consequences. He genuinely believed that his gender granted him leadership capabilities that women couldn't possess, regardless of education, experience, or demonstrated competence. I continued typing throughout his entire speech, capturing every word with the precision of a court reporter documenting testimony that would later prove crucial in legal proceedings. 26 years old, sitting at the far end of a conference table, invisible enough that Marcus forgot I was present while he explained why people like me could never handle real responsibility. The marketing coordinator whose job was to take notes and stay quiet while important people made decisions about the company's future. What Marcus didn't know was that I'd been preparing for this moment without realizing it. 2 years of watching incompetent leadership destroy a successful company. 6 months of seeing my strategic innovations implemented by competitors. And now a detailed explanation of why I was biologically incapable of the executive thinking that I'd been demonstrating consistently while he'd been failing systematically. The combination of personal insult and professional opportunity created a clarity that felt almost mathematical in its precision. The rest of the meeting continued, with the surreal normalcy of people pretending that nothing significant had happened. Marcus returned to his analysis of market conditions. Other executives offered their departmental updates, and everyone maintained the professional courtesy that corporate culture demands, even when fundamental boundaries have been crossed. But something had shifted in the room's dynamics, a subtle change in attention and energy that suggested Marcus's speech had created consequences he hadn't anticipated. Jennifer Walsh's questions became more pointed, her financial analysis more detailed in ways that highlighted leadership failures rather than market challenges. Patricia Reeves began documenting operational inefficiencies with the thoroughness of someone building a case rather than simply reporting problems. David Chen's business development updates included more specific comparisons to competitor strategies, emphasizing opportunities that Pinnacle Dynamics was missing through conservative decision-making. Even Michael Torres's human resources metrics took on a different tone, focusing on retention problems and employee satisfaction issues that traced directly back to leadership decisions. I watched this subtle transformation with growing understanding. Marcus's explanation of why women couldn't lead had inadvertently revealed that he was the leadership problem everyone had been too polite to acknowledge directly. By making his assumptions explicit, he'd given permission for more direct analysis of his strategic failures. The female executives he'd just insulted were no longer obligated to protect his ego while discussing the company's problems. And the male executives were beginning to recognize that loyalty to incompetent leadership was becoming professionally dangerous as the company's situation deteriorated. The meeting ended with the usual assignment of action items and scheduling of follow-up discussions. But the energy was different as people gathered their materials and headed back to their respective departments. Conversations continued in the hallway with the intensity of people processing significant information, and I noticed that Jennifer Walsh and Patricia Reeves were walking together toward Jennifer's office with the purposeful stride of executives who had important matters to discuss privately. I returned to my desk with 13 pages of detailed notes and a growing sense that the quarterly strategy meeting had marked some kind of turning point in Pinnacle Dynamics' corporate trajectory. Not because of any strategic decisions that had been made, but because of assumptions that had been revealed, and professional relationships that had been fundamentally altered by 30 seconds of unguarded honesty from a CEO who'd never learned to consider how his words might affect people he didn't view as important. That afternoon brought an unexpected visitor to my desk. Jennifer Walsh approached with the careful demeanor of someone who needed to have a delicate conversation without attracting unwanted attention from colleagues or supervisors. She suggested we grab coffee, ostensibly to discuss some marketing support for an upcoming financial presentation. But her tone suggested that the real purpose of our conversation would be considerably more significant than routine interdepartmental collaboration. The coffee shop across from our office building had become the unofficial location for discussions that couldn't happen within corporate walls. Far enough from Pinnacle Dynamics to avoid accidental encounters with colleagues, but close enough that brief absences wouldn't raise questions about productivity or professional commitment. Jennifer chose a corner table that offered privacy while maintaining clear sightlines to the entrance, the kind of strategic positioning that experienced executives develop for managing sensitive conversations. She waited until we were settled, with our drinks before addressing the morning's events directly. Her approach was measured, professional, but carried an undertone of frustration that she'd been containing for months. The combination of Marcus's insulting commentary and the company's deteriorating performance had apparently reached a threshold where maintaining diplomatic silence was becoming more dangerous than speaking truth about leadership failures that were affecting everyone's professional future. Jennifer's financial analysis painted a picture that was even more concerning than the public version she'd presented during the meeting. The company's cash flow problems were accelerating, major clients were expressing serious concerns about strategic direction, and the cost structure was becoming unsustainable as revenue continued declining while expenses increased due to inefficient management decisions. But the most troubling aspect was the pattern of missed opportunities that traced directly back to Marcus's inability to recognize good ideas when they came from sources he didn't respect. She'd been researching Richardson and Associates' recent success and had discovered what she described as remarkable similarities to strategic proposals that had been submitted internally and rejected by Marcus over the past year. Not just my marketing proposal, but operational improvements suggested by Patricia Reeves, partnership opportunities identified by David Chen, and even human resources initiatives proposed by Michael Torres that could have addressed retention problems before they became critical. Richardson seemed to have access to Pinnacle Dynamics' best thinking, while Pinnacle Dynamics continued implementing strategies that weren't working. The conversation that followed lasted 2 hours and covered topics that I'd never expected to discuss with a senior executive. Jennifer's experience with corporate turnarounds had taught her to recognize the warning signs of companies approaching crisis points, and everything she was observing at Pinnacle Dynamics suggested that dramatic changes would be necessary within the next 6 months to avoid catastrophic failure. The question wasn't whether change would occur, but whether it would be managed strategically or imposed by external forces like creditors, major clients, or competitor acquisitions. But the most significant aspect of our discussion was Jennifer's assessment of internal capabilities. She'd been observing departmental performance for 2 years and had identified a pattern that Marcus seemed incapable of recognizing. The company's best strategic thinking was coming from people who weren't being promoted to positions where they could implement their ideas, while decision-making authority remained concentrated with executives whose approaches weren't producing results. The disconnect between competence and authority was becoming so severe that talented employees were leaving to join competitors who valued their contributions. Jennifer's question about my career aspirations caught me off guard. I'd been focused on surviving corporate culture and building experience, not on developing ambitions for executive leadership that seemed impossibly distant for someone at my level. But her inquiry wasn't casual. She was evaluating internal talent for strategic purposes that she wasn't ready to discuss explicitly. The company was facing challenges that would require innovative leadership, and she was apparently identifying people who might be capable of providing solutions that current management couldn't deliver. Our conversation ended with an understanding that we would continue these discussions as events developed. Jennifer needed allies who understood the company's real situation and could contribute to strategic planning that might not align with Marcus's preferred approach. I needed mentorship from someone who could help me navigate corporate politics while developing capabilities that might eventually lead to meaningful opportunities. The alliance forming between us represented a recognition that Pinnacle Dynamics' future would require different leadership than what currently existed. Walking back to the office, I processed the implications of everything I'd learned. The company was in worse condition than publicly acknowledged. The current leadership was actively preventing the implementation of solutions that could address fundamental problems, and there were people in senior positions who were beginning to consider alternatives to maintaining the status quo. The quarterly strategy meeting had been a catalyst, but the underlying issues had been building for months. That evening, I did something I'd never done before. I opened a new document on my personal laptop and began developing what I privately called the Pinnacle Dynamics Recovery Plan. Not as an employee assignment or professional obligation, but as an intellectual exercise in strategic thinking that addressed the company's actual problems rather than the symptoms that Marcus preferred to acknowledge. 26 years old, sitting in my studio apartment, designing comprehensive solutions for challenges that executives with decades more experience were failing to address effectively. The plan that emerged over the following weeks became my secret obsession. Market analysis that identified specific opportunities Richardson and Associates was exploiting while Pinnacle Dynamics ignored them. Operational improvements that could reduce costs while improving service quality. Partnership strategies that leveraged existing relationships while developing new revenue streams. Human resources initiatives that could reverse retention problems while attracting talent from competitors. Financial restructuring that could improve cash flow while positioning the company for sustainable growth. But the most important component was leadership development. The plan included detailed analysis of current executive capabilities, identification of performance gaps that were preventing effective decision-making, and strategic recommendations for organizational changes that could align authority with competence. I was designing solutions for problems that I wasn't supposed to understand, developing strategies for challenges that weren't officially acknowledged, and creating alternatives to leadership approaches that were systematically destroying the company. What I didn't realize was that someone else was also preparing for change. Someone with access to information that I couldn't obtain and resources that I couldn't imagine. The quarterly strategy meeting had set multiple plans in motion, not just my own intellectual exercise in strategic thinking, but professional maneuvering by people who understood corporate politics at levels I was just beginning to comprehend. The next 6 months would test everyone's assumptions about leadership, competence, and the relationship between gender and executive capability in ways that none of us anticipated. Marcus Blackwood had explained why women couldn't lead during a meeting where women were providing the best analysis and most practical solutions. The irony was about to become even more pronounced as events unfolded that would challenge every assumption he'd made about business leadership and gender-based competence. The marketing coordinator who'd been taking notes at the far end of the conference table was about to demonstrate exactly what kind of leadership the company actually needed. But first, there were lessons to learn, alliances to build, and strategies to refine. The path from marketing coordinator to CEO wasn't going to be direct or easy, but that Thursday morning in the conference room had provided something invaluable: absolute clarity about what needed to change and why the current leadership was incapable of making it happen. Sometimes the most powerful motivation comes from being underestimated by people who should know better. The story was just beginning, and Marcus Blackwood had no idea what he'd set in motion by explaining why someone like me could never handle real responsibility. Time would tell us both exactly what I was capable of achieving when motivated by the perfect combination of professional opportunity and personal determination to prove him catastrophically wrong. The email arrived at 6:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after the quarterly meeting that had changed everything. I was sitting in my kitchen, laptop open on the small dining table, reviewing quarterly performance data while my coffee grew, cold in its mug. The sender was Robert Blackwood, Marcus's father and chairman of the board, requesting a private meeting at his downtown office that afternoon. Not at Pinnacle Dynamics headquarters, not during regular business hours, and certainly not with Marcus's knowledge or approval. The message was brief, professional, and completely unprecedented. In 3 years of working at the company, I'd never received direct communication from the chairman, never been invited to private meetings with board leadership, and never been positioned as anything more than a junior employee who handled marketing tasks efficiently but invisibly. Robert Blackwood was requesting my presence for reasons that couldn't be good news for anyone currently in power at Pinnacle Dynamics, and I found myself wondering exactly how much the company's founder knew about recent developments in strategic planning and leadership effectiveness. My hands trembled slightly as I typed my acceptance, agreeing to the 4 p.m. meeting time while trying to project professional confidence that I wasn't feeling. 26 years old, 3 years out of business, school, and suddenly thrust into corporate politics at levels that I'd never imagined accessing. The marketing coordinator who took notes during meetings was about to have a private conversation with the man who'd built Pinnacle Dynamics from a small consulting firm into a regional powerhouse before handing control to his son 3 years ago. The morning at the office felt surreal, conducting routine tasks while knowing that everything might change by evening. I answered emails about upcoming campaigns, reviewed creative materials for client presentations, and attended departmental meetings where colleagues discussed quarterly objectives as if the company's future wasn't hanging in the balance. The normalcy was almost comforting, providing familiar rhythms that helped manage the anxiety building throughout the day as the 4 p.m. appointment approached. Marcus spent the morning in his office with the door closed, taking calls that seemed increasingly tense based on his gestures visible through the glass partition. Jennifer Walsh had been equally unavailable, attending off-site meetings that weren't listed on any shared calendars. Patricia Reeves moved through the building with unusual urgency, checking systems and reviewing operational protocols with the methodical intensity of someone preparing for significant changes. The executive floor carried an undercurrent of tension that suggested multiple people were managing situations that weren't being discussed openly. David Chen stopped by my desk around 11 a.m. with questions about marketing support for a client presentation, but his real purpose seemed to be gauging my awareness of developing situations. His inquiries about my afternoon schedule were casual but persistent, suggesting that word of my meeting with Robert Blackwood had somehow leaked despite the private nature of our communication. Corporate environments have their own information, networks, and apparently my unprecedented invitation had generated enough interest to warrant subtle investigation by people who understood the political implications better than I did. Lunch was impossible to consider. My stomach churned with nervous energy that made food seem completely unappealing, so I spent the hour reviewing everything I'd documented about Pinnacle Dynamics' strategic challenges over the past 6 months. The comprehensive analysis I'd been developing privately had grown into a detailed assessment of leadership failures, missed opportunities, and systematic problems that were destroying the company's competitive position. If Robert Blackwood wanted honest evaluation of his son's performance, I had 3 months of meticulously documented evidence ready for discussion. The drive to Robert Blackwood's office building took me through the financial district where Pinnacle Dynamics had been founded 43 years earlier. His current offices occupied the top floor of a restored Victorian building that projected old-money elegance without the corporate sterility of modern business complexes. The elevator ride to the 15th floor provided time to review my talking points one final time, though I suspected that Robert Blackwood would be controlling the conversation's direction based on information and objectives that I couldn't anticipate. His receptionist, a woman in her 60s who carried herself with the confidence of someone who'd been managing executive access for decades, greeted me with professional warmth that suggested my appointment was expected and significant. She offered coffee or water, which I declined despite my dry mouth, and explained that Mr. Blackwood was finishing a call but would be available momentarily. The waiting area featured photographs documenting Pinnacle Dynamics' history, showing the company's evolution from a small startup to the regional corporation that Marcus was now systematically destroying through incompetent leadership. When Robert Blackwood emerged from his office, the family resemblance to Marcus was unmistakable, but the differences were even more striking. 71 years old, moving with the deliberate energy of someone who'd built a successful company through decades of strategic thinking and careful decision-making. His handshake was firm without being aggressive, his eye contact direct without being intimidating, and his demeanor suggested someone who'd learned to evaluate people quickly and accurately based on professional necessity rather than personal prejudice. His office reflected the same understated elegance as the building itself, with traditional furnishings that conveyed success without ostentation. The walls featured awards and recognition from industry organizations, photographs with political and business leaders, and artistic pieces that suggested sophisticated tastes developed over years of prosperity. But the most impressive aspect was the view. Panoramic windows that overlooked the city where he'd spent 4 decades building relationships and developing the reputation that Marcus was now squandering through strategic failures and interpersonal incompetence. Robert Blackwood gestured toward a seating area away from his formal desk, creating an atmosphere that was professional but not intimidating. He'd obviously conducted thousands of important conversations in this space, and his approach suggested someone who understood how to put people at ease while maintaining the authority necessary for difficult discussions. When he asked about my experience at Pinnacle Dynamics, his tone carried genuine interest rather than polite formality, indicating that this meeting had purposes beyond casual employee relations. My response was carefully measured, acknowledging the opportunities the company had provided while avoiding direct criticism of current leadership. 3 years of valuable experience, exposure to diverse client relationships, opportunities to develop strategic thinking skills, and appreciation for the company's reputation in competitive markets. Robert Blackwood listened attentively, occasionally, asking follow-up questions that demonstrated familiarity with my departmental responsibilities and professional background that went beyond what any CEO should know about junior employees. When he mentioned my educational background, specifically my MBA thesis on strategic marketing in mature industries, I realized that this conversation had been preceded by research that went far beyond reviewing personnel files. He'd somehow obtained and read academic work that I'd completed before joining Pinnacle Dynamics, suggesting that his interest in my capabilities wasn't recent or casual. Someone had recommended me for this meeting based on detailed knowledge of my analytical abilities and strategic thinking skills, and that someone had access to information that wasn't readily available through normal corporate channels. The conversation shifted when Robert Blackwood asked about my observations regarding Pinnacle Dynamics' competitive position over the past year. His phrasing was careful, inviting honest assessment without explicitly requesting criticism of his son's leadership, but the implication was clear. He wanted unfiltered analysis from someone who understood the company's challenges without being invested in protecting current management from consequences of strategic failures. The marketing coordinator, who attended meetings and took notes, had apparently been noticed by people who valued objective observation over diplomatic silence. I provided detailed analysis that I'd been developing privately, focusing on market trends, competitive challenges, and operational inefficiencies that were affecting the company's performance. Client retention problems, missed partnership opportunities, declining employee morale, and systematic failures to implement strategic innovations that could address fundamental problems. My assessment was thorough but diplomatic, emphasizing challenges rather than assigning blame, though the implications for leadership accountability were unmistakable to anyone familiar with corporate management principles. Robert Blackwood's questions became increasingly specific, demonstrating knowledge of situations that I hadn't expected him to understand. He asked about the Richardson and Associates campaign that had implemented strategies similar to my rejected proposal, about departing employees who'd cited frustration with decision-making processes, and about client feedback regarding Pinnacle Dynamics' responsiveness to changing market conditions. His information was current, detailed, and accurate in ways that suggested ongoing monitoring of company operations, despite his official retirement from day-to-day management responsibilities. The most revealing moment came when he asked about the quarterly strategy meeting 3 weeks earlier, specifically about discussions regarding competitive analysis and strategic planning approaches. His knowledge of what had been said during that meeting was impossibly precise, including details that weren't included in official minutes or distributed summaries. Someone with access to executive-level information was providing regular briefings about internal developments, and that someone had apparently reported Marcus's commentary about women's leadership capabilities with accuracy that made me uncomfortable, about how much Robert Blackwood might know about my personal reactions. When I confirmed that Marcus had indeed made statements about gender-based limitations on executive thinking, Robert Blackwood's expression shifted from professional interest to something much harder. He'd built Pinnacle Dynamics by recognizing talent regardless of conventional expectations, promoting people based on competence rather than demographics, and developing organizational culture that valued results over political considerations. His son's approach represented everything he'd worked to eliminate from corporate environments, and learning about specific incidents had apparently confirmed concerns that had been building for months. The conversation that followed lasted nearly 2 hours and covered topics that I'd never expected to discuss with a company founder. Robert Blackwood's experience with corporate leadership had taught him to recognize the warning signs of organizational failure, and everything he was observing at Pinnacle Dynamics suggested that immediate intervention would be necessary to prevent permanent damage to the company's market position and reputation. He'd been developing contingency plans for several months, but recent developments had accelerated his timeline for implementing changes that Marcus wouldn't approve or understand. His assessment of internal capabilities was brutally honest. The company's current leadership lacked the strategic vision necessary for navigating competitive challenges, the operational competence required for managing complex business relationships, and the interpersonal skills needed for maintaining employee morale during difficult transitions. But more importantly, they lacked the intellectual humility to recognize their limitations and seek assistance from people who could provide solutions to problems they couldn't solve independently. Robert Blackwood's questions about my career aspirations were direct and loaded with implications that I wasn't prepared to address. Did I see myself remaining in marketing indefinitely, or was I interested in broader business responsibilities that could utilize my analytical abilities and strategic thinking skills? Was I committed to Pinnacle Dynamics long-term, or would I consider opportunities with other companies that might offer faster advancement? Did I believe that the company's current challenges were solvable with different leadership approaches, or were the problems too fundamental to address through internal changes? My responses were honest but careful, acknowledging ambitions for increased responsibility while expressing loyalty to the company that had provided valuable professional experience. I wanted opportunities to contribute at higher levels, implement strategic initiatives that could address real challenges, and work with leadership that valued innovative thinking over conventional approaches. But I also understood that rapid advancement required proving competence through smaller assignments before being trusted with broader responsibilities that could affect company performance. The meeting's turning point came when Robert Blackwood presented a scenario that was both opportunity and test. Pinnacle Dynamics would be implementing organizational changes over the next 6 months that would create new positions requiring strategic thinking, analytical capabilities, and leadership potential. These roles would involve significant responsibility, direct client interaction, and authority to implement solutions without requiring approval from people who might not understand innovative approaches. The positions would be demanding, politically challenging, and career-defining for people who could succeed in environments where traditional hierarchy wouldn't provide protection from performance expectations. His offer was stunning in its scope and terrifying in its implications. A newly created position as Strategic Development Director, reporting directly to the chairman rather than current executive leadership, with authority to analyze company operations and recommend changes that could improve competitive positioning. The role would include budget responsibility, staff supervision, and client relationship management that could provide pathway to senior leadership positions if performance justified continued advancement. It was the kind of opportunity that typically required decades of experience to access, offered to someone who'd been taking notes at meetings just weeks earlier. The salary increase was substantial, nearly doubling my current compensation while providing benefits and equity participation that reflected executive-level responsibilities. But more important than financial considerations was the professional development potential. Working directly with board leadership, learning corporate strategy at the highest levels, and gaining experience with decision-making processes that shaped company direction. The position could provide everything necessary for eventual CEO consideration if I could prove capable of handling challenges that had defeated people with much more experience. Robert Blackwood's conditions were straightforward, but demanding. Complete discretion about our discussions and his plans for organizational changes until official announcements were made. Absolute commitment to company success over personal relationships or political considerations that might compromise objective decision-making. Willingness to implement difficult changes that could affect colleagues who'd become friends, including recommendations that might result in personnel adjustments for people who weren't performing effectively. The role required someone who could separate personal feelings from professional necessities when company survival was at stake. The timeline for decision was immediate. Robert Blackwood needed confirmation of my interest by Friday morning, with starting date the following Monday if I accepted the position. The acceleration was necessary because of competitive pressures and internal developments that couldn't wait for extended deliberation. Changes were happening whether I participated or not, but my involvement could influence how those changes were implemented and who would benefit from new opportunities being created. I requested time to consider the offer, which Robert Blackwood granted with understanding that also carried subtle pressure. Other candidates were being evaluated for similar positions, and delay in accepting his offer might result in opportunities being offered elsewhere. The company needed people who could make decisive commitments when presented with career-defining possibilities, and hesitation might indicate unsuitability for roles requiring confident leadership under pressure. His message was clear. This was a moment for action rather than extended analysis. The drive back to my apartment provided time to process implications that seemed almost impossible to believe. 26 years old, 3 years out of business school, and suddenly offered executive-level responsibility at a company where I'd been invisible just weeks earlier. The marketing coordinator who took notes during meetings was being invited to participate in strategic planning that could reshape Pinnacle Dynamics' future, with compensation and authority that reflected genuine confidence in my capabilities, rather than token gestures toward diversity or inclusion. But the offer also carried risks that were substantial and potentially career-ending. Accepting a position that reported to the chairman rather than current leadership would create immediate conflict with Marcus and other executives who might view my advancement as threat to their authority. The role required implementing changes that could affect people who'd been colleagues and friends, making recommendations that might result in personnel decisions affecting people I'd worked with daily for 3 years. Success would require navigating political challenges that could destroy professional relationships while building new alliances with people who operated at levels I'd never accessed. That evening, I called my mentor from business school, Professor Helena Martinez, who'd guided my academic development and provided career advice throughout my professional transition. Helena had spent 15 years in corporate strategy before transitioning to academia, and her experience with organizational change had taught her to recognize opportunities that could transform careers for people prepared to accept appropriate risks. Our conversation lasted until nearly midnight, exploring implications and considerations that I hadn't anticipated during my emotional processing of Robert Blackwood's offer. Helena's analysis was characteristically thorough and challenging. The position represented extraordinary opportunity for someone at my experience level, but it also carried responsibility that could overwhelm people who weren't prepared for the political and strategic complexity of executive leadership. The reporting relationship to board leadership rather than operational management was both protection and isolation, providing authority while potentially creating opposition from people who might view my advancement as illegitimate or threatening. Success would require developing new skills rapidly while maintaining relationships that could support or destroy my effectiveness. Her questions forced me to consider motivations beyond immediate career advancement. Was I accepting this position because it represented logical next step in planned professional development? Or was I being driven by desire to prove Marcus wrong about women's leadership capabilities? Was my interest in the role based on genuine commitment to Pinnacle Dynamics' success, or was I motivated by opportunity to gain power over people who'd underestimated my potential? The distinction was crucial because executive leadership required strategic thinking that transcended personal considerations, focusing on organizational success rather than individual validation. Helena's final advice was direct and memorable. Accepting the position would require becoming a different person professionally, someone capable of making difficult decisions without being paralyzed by personal relationships or emotional considerations. The marketing coordinator who'd been taking notes at meetings would need to develop into an executive who could command respect from people who'd previously ignored her, implement changes that might be unpopular but necessary, and maintain focus on company success even when personal costs were substantial. The transformation would be challenging, but potentially career-defining if I could manage the transition successfully. Wednesday morning brought clarity that surprised me with its simplicity. I'd been preparing for this opportunity without realizing it developing analytical skills and strategic thinking through private projects that had equipped me for exactly the kind of challenges Robert Blackwood was offering. The comprehensive company analysis I'd been working on independently demonstrated my capability for executive-level thinking, while my observations of leadership failures had provided education in what not to do when given authority to make important decisions. The email I sent to Robert Blackwood accepting his offer was brief, professional, and decisive. I appreciated his confidence in my capabilities, understood the responsibilities and expectations associated with the position, and was committed to contributing everything necessary for Pinnacle Dynamics' success in competitive markets. The Strategic Development Director role represented exactly the kind of challenge I'd been seeking, and I was prepared to begin immediately with whatever transition process he recommended. His response arrived within an hour, confirming my starting date and providing instructions for the orientation process that would begin Friday afternoon after regular business hours. The confidential nature of our arrangement meant that my current colleagues wouldn't be informed about organizational changes until official announcements were made the following week, creating temporary awkwardness but protecting the strategic planning process from internal resistance that might complicate implementation. I would continue my marketing responsibilities through Friday while beginning strategic development training that would prepare me for expanded authority. The rest of Wednesday and Thursday passed in a haze of surreal normalcy. I attended meetings where Marcus discussed quarterly objectives that he wouldn't be implementing, answered emails about campaigns that would soon become someone else's responsibility, and maintained professional relationships with colleagues who had no idea that everything was about to change dramatically. The marketing coordinator who'd been invisible for 3 years was about to become a strategic development director, with authority to evaluate and modify the very systems we were all working within. Jennifer Walsh approached my desk Thursday afternoon with the careful demeanor of someone who'd noticed unusual activities but couldn't identify their source. Her questions about my recent schedule were diplomatic but persistent, suggesting that she'd observed changes in my behavior or responsibilities that warranted investigation. The coffee meeting she suggested for the following week would have to be rescheduled based on my new role, but I couldn't explain the situation without violating confidentiality agreements that were protecting organizational changes still in development. Patricia Reeves displayed similar awareness of developing situations, asking about my long-term career interests with timing that seemed more than coincidental. Her experience with corporate transitions had apparently taught her to recognize the subtle signs of personnel changes before official announcements, and she might have been positioning herself for whatever developments were approaching. The conversation was pleasant, but loaded with implications that neither of us could address directly, given the circumstances that were constraining open discussion. Friday afternoon brought the conclusion of my career as marketing coordinator and the beginning of something completely unprecedented. Robert Blackwood's offices after business hours felt different from our Tuesday meeting, more focused and urgent as we discussed implementation strategies for changes that would reshape Pinnacle Dynamics over the following months. The orientation process included detailed briefings about company finances, competitive analysis, and strategic challenges that went far beyond anything I'd accessed in my previous role. The documents he provided painted a picture that was even more concerning than I'd realized. Pinnacle Dynamics was facing existential threats that required immediate intervention to prevent competitive failure or potential acquisition by rivals who were systematically capturing market share. The company's problems weren't just about missed opportunities or inefficient operations. They were about fundamental leadership failures that were destroying relationships and reputation that had taken decades to build. But the most significant revelation was learning about the board's decision-making process regarding Marcus's continued authority. Robert Blackwood had been documenting performance problems for 18 months, building case for leadership changes that would be implemented gradually to minimize disruption while maximizing likelihood of successful transition. My position as Strategic Development Director wasn't just about individual career advancement. It was part of comprehensive strategy for saving the company that Marcus was systematically destroying through incompetence and arrogance. Monday morning would bring the beginning of my new role and the acceleration of changes that would transform Pinnacle Dynamics into something completely different from what it had been under Marcus's leadership. The marketing coordinator who'd been taking notes at meetings was about to become part of the solution to problems that had seemed insurmountable just weeks earlier. The woman who supposedly couldn't lead according to Marcus was about to demonstrate exactly what kind of leadership the company actually needed to survive and thrive. The strategic planning process that would unfold over the following months would test everything I'd learned about business, challenge every assumption about corporate hierarchy, and provide opportunities that most people never access in entire careers. But first, there were organizational changes to implement, resistance to overcome, and results to deliver that would prove or disprove Robert Blackwood's confidence in my executive potential. The real story was just beginning, and Marcus Blackwood still had no idea that his dismissive comments about women's leadership capabilities had set in motion events that would demonstrate exactly how wrong his assumptions had been. Tuesday morning would bring the first test of my new authority, and by the end of the week, everyone at Pinnacle Dynamics would understand that the company's leadership structure had changed in ways that would reshape everyone's professional future. The emergency board meeting was called for 8 a.m. Monday morning, 30 minutes before regular business hours when most employees would be arriving at the office. I sat in the executive conference room that I'd only observed from the outside during my 3 years as marketing coordinator, now occupying a leather chair at the mahogany table where strategic decisions were made that affected the entire company's future. The transformation from note-taking observer to participating decision-maker felt surreal and terrifying in equal measure. Robert Blackwood commanded the room with the quiet authority of someone who'd built a successful company through decades of strategic thinking and careful relationship management. The 5 other board members represented diverse professional backgrounds, but they shared the common characteristic of people who'd achieved significant success through competence rather than inherited privilege. Their attention focused on me with curiosity mixed with skepticism, evaluating the 26-year-old marketing coordinator who'd been elevated to strategic development director over the weekend through processes they hadn't witnessed. Marcus entered the conference room at exactly 8 a.m., his usual confident stride faltering slightly when he noticed my presence at the executive table. His confusion was obvious as he processed the reality that his father had made organizational changes without consultation or advance warning. The man who'd explained why women couldn't lead just weeks earlier was now facing a situation where a woman he'd dismissed as intellectually inferior was sitting in a position of authority that challenged his fundamental assumptions about corporate hierarchy. Jennifer Walsh and Patricia Reeves arrived together, their expressions suggesting they'd been discussing developments that were becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. David Chen followed closely behind, carrying files that indicated he'd been preparing for discussions about business development challenges that required immediate attention. Michael Torres brought documentation about human resources issues that were affecting company morale and employee retention. The department heads had been summoned to address problems that Marcus had been avoiding or minimizing for months. Robert Blackwood opened the meeting by acknowledging that significant organizational changes were necessary to address competitive challenges that threatened Pinnacle Dynamics' market position. His tone was measured but firm, establishing that these weren't suggestions for consideration, but decisions that had been made based on careful analysis of company performance and strategic requirements. The board had evaluated internal capabilities and external opportunities, concluding that immediate intervention was required to prevent further deterioration of business relationships and financial stability. The presentation of quarterly results painted a picture that was even more concerning than the sanitized version Marcus had been providing to employees and clients. Revenue had declined 23% from the previous year. Major client relationships were terminating contracts at unprecedented rates, and operational costs were consuming increasingly larger percentages of diminished income. The company was approaching financial crisis that would require dramatic changes in leadership approach and strategic direction to avoid bankruptcy or forced acquisition by competitors. Marcus's response revealed everything about his character and leadership, philosophy that had been destroying the company for 3 years. Instead of acknowledging failures or accepting responsibility for strategic decisions that had produced these catastrophic results, he began explaining why external market forces were responsible for problems beyond his control. His analysis focused on economic conditions, regulatory changes, and competitive advantages gained by rivals through unfair practices, rather than examining internal factors that could be addressed through improved management approaches. The presentation I'd been preparing since Friday night addressed every excuse Marcus offered with detailed analysis that demonstrated how other companies in similar markets had successfully navigated the same challenges through strategic thinking and effective implementation. My research showed that Richardson and Associates had gained market share by implementing exactly the kind of innovative approaches that Marcus had rejected when they were proposed internally. The competitive disadvantages he blamed on external factors were actually self-imposed limitations created by his refusal to consider ideas that challenged his preconceptions. Jennifer Walsh's financial analysis supported my strategic assessment, with data that was impossible to dispute. The company's cash flow problems weren't caused by market conditions, but by operational inefficiencies and missed opportunities that traced directly back to leadership decisions. Client retention issues weren't industry-wide phenomena, but specific problems with service delivery and relationship management that could be addressed through improved processes and personnel changes. The financial crisis was preventable and correctable if appropriate actions were taken immediately. Patricia Reeves presented operational data that revealed systematic failures in project management, quality control, and customer service that were driving client dissatisfaction and contract terminations. Her recommendations for addressing these problems had been submitted repeatedly over the past 18 months, but implementation had been delayed or modified to the point of ineffectiveness. The operational improvements necessary for competitive success required authority to make changes without interference from management that didn't understand the technical requirements for effective service delivery. David Chen's business development report documented missed partnership opportunities, failed client acquisitions, and strategic initiatives that had been abandoned when they required sustained effort or innovative thinking. His analysis showed that competitors were securing relationships with companies that Pinnacle Dynamics could have partnered with if leadership had been willing to invest time and resources in building collaborative arrangements. The business development failures weren't caused by market saturation, but by internal resistance to approaches that required long-term thinking rather than immediate results. Michael Torres's human resources metrics revealed the internal cost of Marcus's leadership approach in terms that were impossible to ignore. Employee turnover had reached 68% annually. Exit interviews consistently cited frustration with decision-making processes and lack of advancement opportunities, and recruitment efforts were failing because the company's reputation in professional networks had deteriorated significantly. The human capital problems were affecting every department and would require comprehensive changes in management philosophy to address effectively. The board's response to these presentations was swift and decisive. Marcus would be removed from operational authority immediately, transitioning to a consulting role that maintained his title while eliminating his ability to make strategic decisions that affected company performance. The change would be announced as temporary leadership adjustment necessitated by his need to focus on special projects, but everyone in the room understood that this was permanent demotion, disguised as face-saving opportunity for someone whose competence had been thoroughly discredited. My appointment as interim chief operating officer was presented as temporary elevation necessitated by the company's need for immediate strategic direction from someone who understood operational requirements and competitive challenges. The position included authority to implement the strategic recommendations I'd presented, hire personnel necessary for effective execution, and modify organizational structures that were preventing efficient operations. The interim designation provided flexibility for future adjustments, while acknowledging that permanent appointments would depend on performance results over the following 6 months. Jennifer Walsh was promoted to Chief Executive Officer, recognizing her financial expertise and strategic capabilities that had been underutilized under Marcus's leadership. Her appointment represented board confidence in her ability to guide the company through the challenging transition period while implementing changes necessary for long-term sustainability. The promotion elevated someone who'd been systematically marginalized despite demonstrating superior analytical abilities and strategic thinking compared to the leadership that had been failing consistently. Patricia Reeves received expanded authority as Chief Operations Officer, providing her with resources and decision-making power necessary for implementing operational improvements that she'd been recommending for months. David Chen was promoted to Vice President of Strategic Partnerships, acknowledging his relationship-building abilities while giving him authority to pursue opportunities that had been blocked by previous management resistance. Michael Torres became Chief Human Resources Officer with mandate to address retention problems and rebuild organizational culture that valued competence over political considerations. The organizational restructuring represented complete transformation of Pinnacle Dynamics' leadership structure, replacing inherited privilege and gender-based assumptions with merit-based appointments that aligned authority with demonstrated capabilities. The changes acknowledged that the company's problems weren't caused by market conditions or competitive disadvantages, but by leadership failures that could be corrected through better decision-making and strategic implementation. Marcus's reaction to these announcements revealed the depth of his delusion about his own capabilities and the company's situation. He argued that the board was making emotional decisions based on temporary setbacks rather than strategic thinking about long-term market positioning. His analysis dismissed the evidence presented by department heads as incomplete or biased, insisting that his leadership approach would eventually produce results if given sufficient time and resources. The cognitive dissonance was stunning to observe as he rejected overwhelming evidence of failure while maintaining confidence in approaches that had been systematically destroying the company. The most telling moment came when Marcus directly challenged my qualifications for increased responsibility, arguing that my lack of senior management experience made me unsuitable for operational authority regardless of my analytical abilities or strategic recommendations. His objection wasn't based on specific concerns about my capabilities, but on fundamental assumptions about experience requirements and organizational hierarchy that prioritized credentials over competence. The man who'd explained why women couldn't lead was now arguing that young professionals couldn't handle responsibility even when they demonstrated superior understanding of company challenges. Robert Blackwood's response was measured but devastating. He acknowledged Marcus's concerns while presenting evidence that experience without effectiveness was less valuable than competence without extensive credentials. My strategic analysis had identified problems and solutions that senior executives with decades of experience had failed to recognize or address. The board's responsibility was to appoint people who could produce results rather than maintain traditional hierarchy that protected incompetent leadership from consequences of poor performance. The meeting concluded with implementation timeline that would begin immediately and continue over the following 3 months. Organizational changes would be announced to employees and clients through carefully coordinated communications that emphasized continuity and improvement rather than crisis and replacement. The new leadership team would work together to implement strategic initiatives that addressed operational problems while building foundation for sustainable growth in competitive markets. My first day as interim chief operating officer began with a series of departmental meetings designed to assess current capabilities and identify immediate priorities for performance improvement. The conversations revealed problems that were more extensive than even my detailed analysis had suggested, with systemic inefficiencies and communication failures affecting every aspect of company operations. The marketing department was implementing strategies that hadn't been updated in 2 years. The operations team was using processes that created unnecessary delays and quality problems. And the business development group was pursuing opportunities that didn't align with company capabilities or market positioning. The client relationship review that Jennifer Walsh and I conducted together painted an alarming picture of deteriorating partnerships that required immediate intervention to prevent further contract terminations. 3 major clients had submitted formal complaints about service quality and responsiveness that weren't being addressed effectively by current management. 2 strategic partnerships were considering termination due to communication problems and missed deliverables that could have been prevented through better project management. The client retention crisis was accelerating and would require comprehensive changes in service delivery approaches to stabilize existing relationships while building confidence for future growth. Patricia Reeves's operational assessment revealed infrastructure problems that were creating inefficiencies throughout the organization, from outdated technology systems that slowed project completion to workspace organization that hindered collaboration between departments. Her recommendations for addressing these issues required capital investment and process changes that Marcus had been delaying or rejecting for budgetary reasons that didn't consider the long-term costs of operational inefficiency. The improvements were necessary for competitive positioning and would provide return on investment through improved productivity and client satisfaction. David Chen's partnership analysis identified 12 potential collaboration opportunities that could provide new revenue streams while strengthening competitive positioning in growing market segments. His relationship development work had created foundation for strategic alliances that required executive-level commitment and resources to implement effectively. The partnerships represented significant growth potential that had been neglected, due to leadership focus on maintaining existing operations rather than pursuing innovative expansion strategies. Michael Torres's employee survey results revealed organizational culture problems that were affecting morale, productivity, and retention rates across all departments. Staff members reported feeling undervalued and excluded from decision-making processes that affected their work, while management communication was described as inconsistent and sometimes contradictory. The culture problems were systemic and would require sustained attention to rebuild trust and engagement that had been damaged by years of ineffective leadership. The strategic planning session that occupied my entire second day in the new role focused on developing integrated solutions that addressed multiple organizational challenges simultaneously, rather than treating each problem as isolated issue, requiring separate intervention. My approach emphasized systemic thinking that recognized how operational improvements, client relationship management, partnership development, and employee engagement were interconnected aspects of comprehensive transformation that could reinforce each other when implemented coordinatively. The implementation plan that emerged from these discussions represented the most ambitious organizational change initiative in Pinnacle Dynamics history, involving every department and affecting every aspect of company operations, from technology infrastructure to client communication protocols. The timeline was aggressive, but necessary given the competitive pressures and financial constraints that required rapid improvement in performance metrics that clients and partners were monitoring closely. Jennifer Walsh's financial modeling showed that successful implementation could restore profitability within 6 months, while positioning the company for sustained growth in expanding market segments. The investment required for operational improvements and personnel additions would be recovered through increased efficiency and client retention, with additional return generated by new business development opportunities that improved competitive positioning would enable. The financial projections were optimistic but realistic, based on performance improvements that other companies had achieved through similar transformation initiatives. The client communication strategy that we developed emphasized transparency about organizational changes while focusing on improved service delivery and expanded capabilities that would benefit existing relationships. Rather than treating leadership transitions as internal matter that didn't concern clients, we positioned the changes as strategic improvements that demonstrated company commitment to excellence and responsiveness. The communication approach was designed to rebuild confidence while providing concrete evidence of enhanced capabilities through improved performance metrics. The Employee Engagement Initiative addressed culture problems through expanded participation in decision-making processes, improved communication about company direction and individual contributions, and advancement opportunities that rewarded competence rather than political considerations. The changes acknowledged that employee satisfaction directly affected client service quality and operational efficiency, making human resources management strategic priority rather than administrative function. The partnership development strategy leveraged David Chen's relationship-building work to pursue collaborative opportunities that could provide rapid market expansion while minimizing capital requirements for independent growth initiatives. The partnerships offered pathway to competitive advantages through shared resources and expertise that individual companies couldn't develop independently, creating mutual benefits that strengthened all participants while improving market positioning. My third day brought the first major test of the new leadership structure when Richardson and Associates contacted Jennifer Walsh about potential merger discussions that could resolve Pinnacle Dynamics' financial challenges through acquisition. Arrangements. The timing wasn't coincidental. Our competitor had been monitoring the company's deteriorating position and recognized that current crisis might create opportunity for consolidation that eliminated competitive threat while acquiring valuable client relationships and operational capabilities. The acquisition discussion revealed how extensively Richardson and Associates had been informed about Pinnacle Dynamics' internal challenges, including detailed knowledge of financial problems, client retention issues, and operational inefficiencies that weren't publicly available information. Someone had been providing regular updates about company vulnerabilities, and the depth of their intelligence suggested ongoing communication with internal sources who had access to confidential strategic information. Jennifer Walsh's response to the acquisition inquiry was diplomatically non-committal, while providing opportunity to gather intelligence about Richardson's strategic intentions and information sources. The conversation revealed that they'd been preparing acquisition proposal for several months, suggesting that their knowledge of Pinnacle Dynamics problems was based on systematic monitoring rather than recent opportunistic interest. The timing of their approach immediately following leadership changes indicated that they'd been waiting for organizational crisis to create favorable negotiation conditions. The board meeting called to address the acquisition inquiry provided forum for discussing strategic alternatives that could preserve company independence while addressing financial challenges that made external acquisition seem attractive to potential buyers. Robert Blackwood's position was clear. The company his father had founded wouldn't be sold to competitors unless absolutely necessary for employee protection and client service continuity. The organizational changes had been implemented specifically to avoid acquisition by demonstrating that internal solutions could address problems that had created vulnerability. My presentation analyzing the acquisition proposal focused on strategic disadvantages of merger arrangements that would eliminate Pinnacle Dynamics as independent entity while providing Richardson and Associates with competitive advantages worth more than their proposed purchase price. The analysis showed that successful implementation of internal improvements could generate greater long-term value than immediate sale, while preserving employment opportunities and client relationships. That acquisition would likely modify or eliminate through consolidation efficiencies. The decision to reject Richardson's acquisition inquiry while implementing accelerated performance improvements created timeline pressure that required immediate results to demonstrate that internal solutions could address problems that had made external sale seem necessary. The next 60 days would determine whether the new leadership team could deliver improvements quickly enough to stabilize financial position and restore competitive confidence before crisis conditions forced reconsideration of alternatives that everyone preferred to avoid. The weekend planning session that Jennifer Walsh, Patricia Reeves, David Chen, Michael Torres, and I conducted at Robert Blackwood's downtown offices focused on implementation strategies that could produce measurable results within 30 days, while building foundation for sustained improvements over a longer timeline. The session represented unprecedented collaboration between department heads who'd been isolated from strategic planning under Marcus's leadership approach that concentrated decision-making authority while excluding operational expertise from policy development. The action plans that emerged from our weekend discussions assigned specific responsibilities and performance metrics to each department, while establishing communication protocols that ensured coordination between initiatives that affected multiple operational areas. My role as Interim Chief Operating Officer involved oversight coordination rather than micromanagement, providing resources and removing obstacles while allowing department heads to implement improvements using their specialized expertise and institutional knowledge. The Monday morning announcement of organizational changes to all employees emphasized opportunity and improvement rather than crisis and replacement, focusing on enhanced capabilities and expanded resources that would benefit everyone through improved competitive positioning and operational efficiency. The communication strategy acknowledged that changes were significant, while positioning them as strategic advancement rather than emergency intervention necessitated by leadership failures. The first week of implementation exceeded performance expectations that had been established based on conservative projections about organizational change resistance and learning curve challenges. Client satisfaction scores improved immediately, as enhanced communication protocols and expedited service delivery addressed problems that had been festering under previous management. Employee engagement surveys showed dramatic improvement in morale and optimism about company direction, while operational efficiency metrics demonstrated measurable gains in productivity and quality control. The Richardson and Associates response to our rejection of their acquisition proposal revealed that they'd been counting on organizational crisis to force acceptance of terms that significantly undervalued the company's potential under competent leadership. Their subsequent competitive moves suggested frustration with lost opportunity to eliminate rival through purchase arrangements, leading to more aggressive pricing strategies and client recruitment efforts that required enhanced defensive measures from our improved operations. The transformation of Pinnacle Dynamics from failing company, threatened by acquisition, to competitive organization, implementing successful improvements, demonstrated how quickly effective leadership could address problems that had seemed insurmountable under incompetent management. The changes proved that organizational challenges weren't caused by external market forces or structural limitations, but by leadership failures that could be corrected through better decision-making and strategic implementation. Marcus's reaction to these rapid improvements revealed the depth of his disconnection from company realities and his inability to acknowledge that his leadership approach had been systematically destroying organizational capabilities. Instead of recognizing that changes were producing results he'd been unable to achieve, he argued that temporary improvements didn't demonstrate long-term viability, and that eventual failure would vindicate his more conservative strategic approach. The irony was unmistakable. The marketing coordinator, who supposedly lacked executive capabilities according to Marcus, was implementing strategic solutions that were restoring financial stability and competitive positioning that his leadership had compromised. The woman who couldn't handle complex thinking was demonstrating analytical abilities and decision-making competence that exceeded anything he'd produced during 3 years of organizational deterioration. But the most significant transformation was personal rather than professional. 3 weeks into my new role, I'd developed confidence and strategic thinking skills that I hadn't realized I possessed, while building relationships with colleagues who'd become collaborators rather than hierarchical superiors. The interim designation of my position seemed increasingly irrelevant, as performance results demonstrated capabilities that warranted permanent recognition rather than temporary accommodation. The strategic planning horizon was expanding beyond crisis management toward growth initiatives that could position Pinnacle Dynamics for market leadership rather than mere survival. The foundation established through rapid improvements was creating opportunities for innovations that could transform the company into something more successful than it had ever been under previous leadership approaches that prioritized stability over advancement. The next phase of implementation would test whether initial successes could be sustained and expanded into comprehensive transformation that permanently solved problems that had been accumulating for years. But the early results provided confidence that effective leadership could achieve organizational changes that had seemed impossible just weeks earlier, proving that competence was more important than experience when addressing challenges that required innovative thinking rather than conventional approaches. The hostile takeover attempt came disguised as a generous partnership proposal, delivered through Marcus's personal attorney on a Thursday morning, exactly 6 weeks after the organizational restructuring had begun showing dramatic results. I was reviewing client retention analytics in my office when Robert Blackwood's emergency call interrupted my analysis of quarterly performance improvements that were exceeding our most optimistic projections. Richardson and Associates had apparently decided that if they couldn't acquire Pinnacle Dynamics through negotiated purchase, they would attempt a coordinated assault designed to force capitulation through systematic destruction of our competitive position. The strategy was sophisticated and multifaceted, targeting every aspect of our recent improvements through coordinated attacks that had obviously been planned for months. Richardson had recruited 3 of our former employees who'd been terminated during Marcus's tenure, people with access to confidential client information and operational procedures that could be weaponized against current business relationships. The timing wasn't accidental. They'd waited until our recovery efforts were showing success before launching offensive designed to undermine exactly the competitive advantages we'd been building through strategic improvements. Jennifer Walsh's emergency analysis of the financial implications revealed that Richardson's approach involved more than simple business competition. They were implementing predatory pricing strategies that sacrificed short-term profitability to eliminate our market position, offering existing clients terms that couldn't be sustained long-term but were attractive enough to trigger contract reviews and renegotiation demands. The financial warfare was designed to force unsustainable cost reductions that would compromise service quality while draining resources necessary for continued operational improvements. The client recruitment campaign that David Chen discovered through his industry contacts was even more concerning than the pricing attacks. Richardson was systematically approaching our major accounts with detailed knowledge of their specific needs, project histories, and relationship challenges that could only have come from internal sources with access to confidential business development information. The recruitment efforts weren't random competitive moves, but targeted strikes against partnerships that represented foundation of our revenue stability and growth planning. Patricia Reeves's investigation into operational security breaches revealed that someone with current access to internal systems was providing real-time intelligence about our strategic initiatives, implementation timelines, and vulnerability assessments that Richardson was using to coordinate their attacks. The data breach wasn't historical information from former employees, but ongoing surveillance that suggested active collaboration between external competitors and internal sources who were systematically betraying company interests for personal or financial gain. Michael Torres's confidential inquiry into personnel loyalty identified several employees whose recent behavioral changes and access patterns suggested potential involvement in information-sharing activities that violated employment agreements and professional ethics standards. The investigation required delicate handling to avoid creating organizational paranoia while identifying security risks that threatened ongoing recovery efforts and future strategic planning. The internal betrayal represented threat to company survival that extended beyond external competitive pressure. The board meeting convened that afternoon carried urgency and tension that reflected awareness that Pinnacle Dynamics was facing existential crisis that required immediate, decisive action to prevent permanent destruction of market position and client relationships. The improvements we'd achieved over 6 weeks could be eliminated within days if Richardson's coordinated assault succeeded in destabilizing financial position and operational capabilities that had been restored through comprehensive transformation initiatives. Robert Blackwood's assessment was characteristically direct and uncompromising. The company was under attack by competitors who were willing to sacrifice industry ethics and legal boundaries to eliminate rival they couldn't defeat through legitimate business competition. The situation required response that demonstrated strength and strategic sophistication while protecting company interests and employee welfare. The board's responsibility was to provide resources and authority necessary for comprehensive defensive measures that could neutralize threats while maintaining competitive positioning. My strategic analysis of Richardson's offensive identified vulnerabilities in their approach that could be exploited through coordinated counterattack designed to expose their predatory practices while reinforcing our competitive advantages through enhanced client relationships and operational excellence. The response strategy involved multiple components that addressed immediate threats while building long-term defensive capabilities that would prevent future attacks from achieving similar penetration of our organizational security and market positioning. The client retention initiative that we implemented immediately involved direct communication with every major account, providing detailed information about Richardson's predatory pricing strategies while demonstrating enhanced service capabilities that justified premium positioning based on value rather than lowest cost considerations. The approach required confidence in our operational improvements and service quality that had been developed through recent transformation efforts, positioning competitive advantages as strategic benefits rather than defensive responses to external pressure. Jennifer Walsh's financial counterstrike involved comprehensive analysis of Richardson's pricing strategies that demonstrated their unsustainable nature while highlighting hidden costs and service limitations that made their proposals less attractive when examined thoroughly. Her presentation to targeted clients included detailed comparisons that emphasized long-term partnership value versus short-term cost reductions that could compromise project quality and relationship stability over extended timeframes. The partnership development acceleration that David Chen orchestrated involved expedited implementation of collaboration agreements that had been under negotiation for months, creating strategic alliances that strengthened competitive positioning, while providing additional revenue streams that reduced dependence on accounts that Richardson was targeting for recruitment. The partnerships offered mutual benefits that were more valuable than individual client relationships while creating network effects that enhanced overall market influence. Patricia Reeves's operational security enhancement involved comprehensive review of information access protocols, implementation of advanced monitoring systems that could detect unauthorized data transfers, and establishment of compartmentalized communication procedures that limited exposure of sensitive strategic information to personnel who didn't require access for legitimate business purposes. The security improvements protected current initiatives while providing foundation for future strategic planning that couldn't be compromised through internal betrayal. The internal investigation that Michael Torres conducted with external security consultants identified 3 employees who had been providing confidential information to Richardson and Associates in exchange for financial compensation and promises of employment opportunities that would be available after Pinnacle Dynamics' anticipated failure. The betrayal was systematic and extensive, involving people who had been trusted with strategic planning information and client relationship details that formed foundation of Richardson's attack strategy. The legal response that we developed with corporate attorneys involved documentation of Richardson's predatory practices, evidence of corporate espionage through recruited internal sources, and preparation of litigation that could expose their illegal competitive methods while seeking damages for business interference and intellectual property theft. The legal strategy was designed to create consequences for unethical behavior while protecting our business interests through injunctive relief that could limit their ability to continue predatory attacks. The counteroffensive that I coordinated with Jennifer Walsh and David Chen involved systematic exposure of Richardson's financial vulnerabilities and operational limitations that made their aggressive expansion strategies unsustainable without continued predatory pricing that would eventually damage their own profitability and market reputation. Our intelligence gathering revealed that their attack on Pinnacle Dynamics was part of a broader pattern of unethical competitive practices that had created enemies throughout the industry. The media strategy that we implemented through professional communications consultants involved controlled disclosure of Richardson's predatory practices and corporate espionage activities that violated industry ethics standards while demonstrating Pinnacle Dynamics' commitment to legitimate business, competition, and client service excellence. The public relations approach positioned our company as victim of unethical attacks, while highlighting operational improvements and strategic innovations that differentiated our services from competitors who relied on illegal methods. The industry alliance building that David Chen accelerated involved collaboration with other companies that had been targeted by Richardson's predatory practices, creating coalition that could share intelligence about their methods while coordinating defensive measures that limited their ability to continue systematic attacks on competitor organizations. The alliance provided mutual protection while establishing network of relationships that enhanced collective competitive positioning against unethical market participants. The client education campaign that we launched involved detailed analysis of Richardson's business practices, financial stability, and service limitations that clients should consider when evaluating partnership proposals that seemed too attractive to be sustainable. The educational approach provided value-added consulting that demonstrated our analytical capabilities while helping clients make informed decisions about vendor relationships that could affect their own business success. The employee retention and motivation initiative that Michael Torres implemented involved enhanced communication about company strategic direction, increased participation in decision-making processes that affected their work, and professional development opportunities that demonstrated commitment to their career advancement within organization that valued competence and ethical behavior. The internal strengthening was necessary to prevent future betrayal while building organizational culture that could resist external recruitment attempts. The technological innovation acceleration that Patricia Reeves coordinated involved implementation of advanced systems and procedures that enhanced operational efficiency while creating competitive advantages that couldn't be easily replicated by organizations that relied on stolen information rather than legitimate innovation. The technological improvements provided foundation for service capabilities that justified premium positioning based on demonstrated value rather than lowest-cost competition. The financial performance that resulted from our coordinated defensive strategy exceeded expectations that had been established for crisis management scenarios. Client retention rates improved despite aggressive competitive pressure. Operational efficiency continued increasing through enhanced security and communication procedures, and new business development accelerated as industry recognition of our ethical standards and operational excellence attracted clients who valued long-term partnership relationships over short-term cost considerations. The legal resolution that emerged after 6 weeks of litigation and industry pressure involved Richardson and Associates agreeing to cease predatory pricing practices, terminate recruited employees who had violated confidentiality agreements, and provide financial compensation for damages caused by corporate espionage and business interference. The settlement established precedent for industry ethics standards while providing resources that could be invested in continued operational improvements and competitive advantage development. The organizational culture transformation that resulted from successfully defending against coordinated attack created sense of shared purpose and mutual trust that strengthened collaboration between departments while building confidence in leadership capabilities and strategic direction. The crisis had demonstrated that effective management could protect employee interests and company stability, even when facing sophisticated threats from competitors with superior resources and fewer ethical constraints. The strategic planning horizon that emerged from crisis resolution extended beyond defensive measures toward aggressive growth initiatives that could position Pinnacle Dynamics for market leadership through innovation and service excellence rather than mere survival. Through competitive responses, the foundation established through successful defense provided platform for expansion strategies that could transform the company into industry leader rather than vulnerable target for predatory attacks. Marcus's reaction to these developments revealed the complete disconnect between his assessment of company capabilities and the reality of what effective leadership could achieve through strategic thinking and collaborative implementation. Instead of acknowledging that his former subordinates had successfully defended against threats that his leadership approach would have been unable to address, he argued that temporary success didn't demonstrate long-term viability and that eventual failure would vindicate his predictions about women's inability to handle complex executive responsibilities. The irony was devastating in its clarity. The marketing coordinator, who supposedly lacked strategic thinking abilities, had orchestrated comprehensive defensive strategy that neutralized sophisticated corporate attack while strengthening competitive positioning and organizational culture. The woman who couldn't handle pressure, according to Marcus, had demonstrated crisis management capabilities that exceeded anything he'd produced during 3 years of organizational decline under external competitive pressure that was less severe than what we'd just successfully addressed. The board evaluation of my performance during the crisis period resulted in removal of interim designation from my Chief Operating Officer title, acknowledging that results had demonstrated permanent executive capabilities rather than temporary crisis management effectiveness. The promotion recognition came with expanded authority and resources necessary for implementing growth strategies that could build on defensive success while positioning the company for sustained competitive advantage through continued innovation and operational excellence. Jennifer Walsh's parallel promotion to permanent Chief Executive Officer reflected similar board confidence in leadership capabilities that had been demonstrated through financial management and strategic coordination during hostile takeover defense. Her appointment represented acknowledgement that gender-based leadership assumptions were less important than demonstrated competence under pressure and ability to produce results that protected organizational interests while building foundation for future success. The strategic partnership opportunities that emerged from industry recognition of our ethical standards and defensive capabilities included collaboration proposals from companies that valued integrity and operational excellence over short-term cost advantages. The partnerships offered revenue diversification and market expansion possibilities that could reduce vulnerability to future predatory attacks while creating network effects that enhanced collective competitive positioning. The client relationship, strengthening that resulted from transparent communication about competitive threats and defensive strategies, created loyalty and trust that extended beyond immediate business transactions toward long-term strategic partnerships based on mutual respect and shared commitment to ethical business practices. The relationship depth provided stability that couldn't be undermined through pricing attacks or recruitment attempts by competitors who relied on transactional rather than collaborative approaches. The employee engagement metrics that Michael Torres documented showed unprecedented levels of satisfaction and organizational commitment that reflected pride in company values and confidence in leadership capabilities. The engagement improvement created retention advantages that reduced recruitment costs while building institutional knowledge and operational expertise that enhanced service quality and innovation capabilities. The operational efficiency gains that Patricia Reeves achieved through enhanced security and communication procedures provided cost advantages that supported competitive pricing without compromising profitability or service quality. The efficiency improvements created sustainable competitive advantages that couldn't be replicated through stolen information or predatory pricing strategies that sacrificed long-term viability for short-term market share gains. The financial performance analysis that Jennifer Walsh presented to the board at the end of the crisis period showed that defensive strategies had actually accelerated improvement trends rather than simply protecting existing capabilities. Revenue growth had continued despite aggressive competitive pressure. Operational costs had decreased through enhanced efficiency and security measures, and profitability had improved through better resource allocation and strategic focus on high-value client relationships. The market positioning assessment that David Chen conducted revealed that Richardson's predatory attacks had actually strengthened Pinnacle Dynamics' reputation among potential clients and industry partners who valued ethical business practices and operational excellence over lowest-cost providers, who might compromise service quality or relationship stability through unsustainable competitive methods. The market response validated strategic decisions to compete based on value rather than price, while maintaining ethical standards that differentiated our services from competitors who relied on questionable practices. The competitive analysis that emerged from crisis resolution showed that successful defense against sophisticated attack had established Pinnacle Dynamics as formidable competitor that couldn't be eliminated through predatory practices or corporate espionage. The demonstration of defensive capabilities and strategic sophistication created deterrent effect that would prevent future attacks while building reputation for competence and integrity that attracted clients and partners who prioritized long-term relationship stability. The innovation pipeline that we developed during crisis management included technological improvements, service enhancements, and operational procedures that provided competitive advantages while creating barriers to entry for competitors who might attempt to replicate our success through imitation rather than genuine innovation. The intellectual property and procedural knowledge that we developed through crisis response became foundation for continued growth and market leadership. The organizational learning that resulted from successfully managing existential crisis created institutional knowledge and crisis management capabilities that would protect against future threats while providing confidence for pursuing aggressive growth strategies that might involve calculated risks. The learning experience had demonstrated that effective leadership could navigate complex challenges while building organizational strength and competitive positioning. The leadership development that I'd experienced through crisis management had accelerated professional growth and strategic thinking capabilities that would have taken years to develop through conventional advancement paths. The compressed timeline and high-stakes decision-making had provided executive education that couldn't be replicated through academic programs or gradual responsibility increases within stable organizational environments. The industry recognition that followed our successful defense against Richardson's attack included speaking opportunities, consulting requests, and advisory positions that acknowledged expertise in crisis management and strategic planning that had been demonstrated through actual performance rather than theoretical knowledge. The recognition provided platform for thought leadership that could benefit Pinnacle Dynamics while building personal reputation for competence and integrity. The transformation of Pinnacle Dynamics from vulnerable target to respected competitor had been completed through collaborative leadership that utilized diverse expertise and maintained ethical standards while achieving results that exceeded expectations for crisis management and defensive strategy implementation. The success proved that effective management could overcome significant challenges while building organizational strength and competitive positioning that provided foundation for continued growth and market leadership. The future planning session that the board conducted after crisis resolution focused on expansion strategies that could leverage competitive advantages we'd developed through defensive success, while building market leadership through innovation and service excellence rather than reactive measures designed to protect against external threats. The strategic horizon had shifted from survival toward dominance through operational excellence and ethical business practices that differentiated our capabilities from competitors who relied on questionable methods. Marcus's final attempt to regain influence involved proposing that crisis success was temporary and that inevitable future challenges would require his experience and conservative leadership approach to navigate safely. His analysis dismissed recent achievements as luck rather than competence, while arguing that sustainable success required traditional management methods that prioritized stability over innovation. The board's response was swift and definitive, acknowledging that his leadership philosophy had been thoroughly discredited by results that demonstrated superior outcomes through approaches he'd considered impossible. The strategic planning process that began immediately after crisis resolution represented complete departure from defensive thinking toward aggressive growth initiatives that could position Pinnacle Dynamics for market leadership through continued innovation and operational excellence. The foundation established through successful crisis management provided confidence for pursuing opportunities that required calculated risks while maintaining ethical standards and organizational culture that had been strengthened through shared success in defending against sophisticated threats. The next phase of organizational development would test whether crisis management success could be translated into sustained growth and market leadership through strategic initiatives that built on competitive advantages while expanding into new markets and service areas that leveraged core competencies. The challenge involved maintaining momentum while scaling operations and capabilities to support expansion strategies that could transform Pinnacle Dynamics into industry leader rather than regional competitor. The phone call came at 9:42 p.m. on a Friday, exactly 18 months after Marcus had declared that women couldn't lead. Robert Blackwood's voice carried excitement that I hadn't heard since our first meeting in his downtown office. Richardson and Associates had just filed for bankruptcy protection, their predatory expansion strategy finally collapsing under unsustainable debt and legal settlements from multiple ethics violations. The company that had tried to destroy us through corporate espionage was now seeking acquisition partners to avoid complete liquidation. Jennifer Walsh and I met Saturday morning to discuss the acquisition opportunity that had materialized overnight. Richardson's client portfolio included relationships we'd been targeting for years. Their technology infrastructure could enhance our operational capabilities, and their market position in 3 key regions would provide expansion opportunities that could triple our revenue within 12 months. The irony was exquisite. The company that had underestimated our capabilities was now dependent on our success for survival. The due diligence process revealed the full extent of Richardson's strategic failures. Marcus's former consulting work had apparently influenced their aggressive tactics, encouraging predatory practices that violated industry standards while creating legal liabilities that eventually overwhelmed their financial resources. The man who'd claimed women lacked strategic thinking had advised competitors into bankruptcy through approaches that prioritized dominance over sustainability. The board meeting that finalized the acquisition was held in the same conference room where Marcus had explained why I couldn't handle complex decisions. I sat at the head of the table as Chief Executive Officer, having been promoted after Jennifer Walsh accepted an offer to lead a Fortune 500 transformation. The marketing coordinator who'd taken notes 18 months earlier was now presenting acquisition strategies that would establish Pinnacle Dynamics as the regional market leader. Marcus attended the meeting as a courtesy, his consulting contract having expired without renewal 6 months earlier. When Robert Blackwood announced the Richardson acquisition and my permanent appointment as CEO, Marcus's expression revealed complete bewilderment at developments that contradicted every assumption he'd made about leadership capabilities and strategic thinking. The woman he'd dismissed was now controlling the company he'd nearly destroyed. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out!